Hello, family. How are you today? I hope everyone listening to the sound of my voice is well. And I'm very excited. I always say I'm excited. We are in a new month, which means that we are in a new theme that we will be covering. So I'm going to do a little review. So, our first month, we discussed challenges, the dynamics of the Black family. In our second month, we discussed the Black woman. And currently, we are in month three, and we will be discussing the challenges faced by school age children. So now we're covering our babies and resources for them, what supports them, how to help them, and to see things through their lens. And so let's get it started. My name is Quanisha Johnson. I'm a licensed counselor and educator, and I am very excited, like I said earlier, to bring this topic to you. It's very close to my heart. Not only am I a licensed counselor, as I stated, I am a licensed educator. So I have taught young children in the classroom setting for many years. And additionally, I'm a mom, and I have children that are across the developmental age range. And I think it's so important that we discuss this today. And let's get it started. Okay, so here we are today. So as you can see, our session one for the next 4 weeks, as I stated, we're going to be discussing challenges faced by school-age learners. And session one is the importance of building self-worth in Black children. How important is this? Absolutely. So here we go. So here we can see just pictures of our children, and we see joy on their faces, and we want to make sure that we are instilling or helping to support their joy and their happiness and their wellness. And children often feel they don't feel like they have a lot of power because we as adults have to tell them what to do, what to eat, where to go, when to sleep. And so we want to empower children by feeling power within themselves. And so today we want to focus on that idea of that self-worth that we want to build, enhance, help to instill within them their worthiness, who they are as Black children. And so here we go. So we want to first talk about, I think it's so important to understand child development, because I think sometimes we don't look at it from the stance that we need to about how our children are developing. And so once again, we're talking about instilling and supporting the self-worth in our Black children. And of course, everything that I'm going to discuss today covers children in general, like child development. We're going to talk about things that impact children. But as you will see through our discussion, there are going to be differences. And this is why I'm hyper focusing today on our Black children, that come from different backgrounds. It makes a difference when we're discussing child development because there are different experiences that they have. So of course, there are going to be some typical normal child development things that occur, ages and stages. And but it's important today, as you see, as to why we're hyper focusing on this group of children. So let's talk a little bit about understanding development. And so child development, basically what it does is describes the phases that children go through as they grow up. So there's different phases from birth and until they meet adulthood. And so children, no matter what, they're our babies and we love them, our children, but they are on a journey towards independence. We ultimately, no matter what, I know it's very hard if you have young children to see them as adults, and we don't want to rush that time. A part of understanding child development will be to appreciate your child for the stage that they're in, but we want to understand that we are raising our children to leave. We're raising them to be in this world, be what it may. I know there are so many challenges out there and things going on, and we want to have them safe and secure and protected, but we are raising them to be independent because we want them to one day be able to be self-sufficient and to be healthy mentally, emotionally, physically. So we want to foster that within the home. So they're on this journey. They go through different stages, but it's so important that we understand how they're developing, paying attention to that, and paying attention to and nurturing each individual child. Even if within a home you have different children, they're all different. So they're on the journey towards independence, but each journey looks different. And so we want to, as parents, as caregivers, those who love them, foster that development and growth, right? And appreciate them for every single stage that they are in. I remember when my kids were babies and not sleeping through the night and buying diapers and just all of that, and like wanting to nap when they nap and trying to figure out the nuances with that, and cooking or cleaning. And that was challenging. And I remember wanting them to just like sleep through the night, and I'm wanting to like push through the stages. And so, but now I have a teenager. And so I'm like, oh, it's hard. Big children, big problems. And so now I'm like wondering about her friendships and wanting to prepare her for college. And so basically, my whole point in saying this is that I've learned, and I want to encourage that we appreciate children, our children, for where they are at the moment, right? To be very, very mindful of the moment. And we always want to push through to the next step. So when we're understanding child development, we're appreciating children for where they are, right? Because there's always another hurdle, something to go through no matter what stage they're in, and they're on this journey. And so there's so many things that adults know, children do not. It doesn't matter like how we see them as sometimes mature, or they're able, some children are more mature than others, but developmentally, there's so many things. The scope of their experiences are different than ours. How they process information is different than ours. How they utilize their brain, right? So like, we know that, and if you don't, that like, the way that a child's brain develops is back to front. And so the prefrontal cortex is the area of the brain for decision making, rationale, and that part develops last. So although we have mature children more so than others, basically a child is going through development, and that part of their brain, that's why we see impulsivity, it develops last. So ultimately the brain's fully developed later on, around the mid-20s. And we do, like I said, have mature children, but there are so many things because of that, and also because of just life experiences that we just know more. We've experienced more, so that we have to keep in mind while raising our children that there are things that we're aware of, and there's things that they don't know that they're learning, and they will learn. Children don't always understand the world the way that we do, and that's kind of tying into that last point. They don't always get it. They get it from their understanding, and so when we're explaining things, we have to keep that in mind. So as they're developing and growing, we must figure out ways as caregivers, as parents, to support that growth and then enhance their learning opportunities. So the scope of their learning and experience can't just be in one environment. It has to be within the home, within the school, within the community. And so we want to foster and help them grow in that developmental stage that they're in, and keep pushing forward because they're on this journey towards independence, and we have to support that. So I wanted to make sure like I covered and talked about how our children develop. There's children, they go through these stages. How they see life is going to look different than how we see our lives and how we see the world. And we have to support them in that. We have to be mindful of our expectations because they are children and they're not adults. And so we have to just make sure that we're understanding that and appreciating them for where they are at that moment. And of course, there's challenges, and we just have to make sure that we are giving them the things that they need. So as I stated, that the expectations have to be realistic, because that's the age group, no matter what, if it's a 4-year-old, if it's an 8-year-old, the way that an 8-year-old understands the world is going to be different than a 12-year-old, and so on and so forth. And like I said, this goes for all children, but ultimately there are some differences with our children. So we're talking today about school-age children, and just wanting you to understand, children begin to develop a sense of self very early on. So just think about, just very simply, a baby, right? A baby knows that a baby wants of course, to be fed, to be changed. But a baby already very early starts to understand that when they cry, their needs may be met. So they're gaining, or they're starting to develop. And it doesn't, of course, as I said, with child development, a baby doesn't understand things the way that even at 3 years old, a 3-year-old will get it. And a 3-year-old is still very young in the toddler stage. But ultimately, when we think about if I cry, my needs I'm going to be held, because maybe I'm just desiring to be held, to be hugged, to be nurtured in that way. They already start to understand and know that that feels good and that they're desiring that. So that sense of who they are and what their needs are, that starts early. So they absorb, school-age children, they start to absorb their world and their environment. They're looking around, they're touching, they're absorbing, they're watching, they're listening. There's always this joke, I suppose, that children are like sponges. They absorb everything. And what's dynamic about them is that the way that it manifests doesn't look like the way that they manifest in terms of taking in that information looks very different than the way we take in information. And so they're just taking everything in, and just their environment is just like, I can only imagine looking through their lens. Now I'm thinking of myself as a child, but how that might feel. And, just to look at the world and see it as this big place, and absorb everything, your conversation, what they hear and what they see. And so there's some good things about that. And there can be some negative things about that as well. They begin to, discover what they like, what they don't like, what feels good, what doesn't, who they like, who they don't like. So they start that in their journey. So let's talk a little bit about like the breakdown. So we have our preschool age children, and they may be the ones at this stage describing themselves in physical terms. So you'll hear them say they know they're tall, short, or, it's very cute when they, my son often says, I'm a fast runner. Or he would always, when he was even smaller, say he runs really fast and would want to show me how fast he can be. And I think this is the time where you see that. That's how the scope of their lens, describing themselves physically. Then we have the early elementary years, and descriptions of self may focus on like their proficiencies, their cognitive abilities, their social skills. So they want to know and describe themselves as smart, and they want to know. They'll say, did I do a good job? Or I did a good job. Or they talk about their friends, and I did this with my friend, and they feel pride with that. So, and how they interact socially. And so early elementary years, this is how they'll see themselves. Then we have young school-age children, and they see themselves in a positive way. And what they'll do sometimes is they'll overestimate their abilities. So I'll give an example of that. So they may see something done, or you may say, oh, come help me load the dishwasher, for example. And then one day they'll decide that mom showed me how to do it. Let me do it myself without permission. And they think they in their mind, they know they can do that. And they overestimate. So then they end up trying something or needing help. So they see this world and they go, I can do it. And so they see themselves in such a positive way that they can do it, they can conquer, they can achieve that. And sometimes because of where they are developmentally, what they think about what they're able to do doesn't match up with the abilities at that age. They will get that ability done and be able to get to that place, but sometimes just overestimating. Often at this age also, they're comparing, themselves, and they do so in the early ages and young school age with the purpose of seeing if something is done fairly. So if I gave you, as a child, you're a young child, and I give you 4 pieces of candy, but then I notice the other student has 6 pieces of candy. So I'm comparing, I'm looking around, I'm noticing. And I think it's unfair, because why do I have 4 and why does he have 6? So that's the scope that they're looking at it with, the lens that they're seeing it through. So that comparison starts. So the whole comparing, and I want you to remember that I'm going to mention comparing quite often, but just that's how they start to see things around them. So then we're continuing our conversation about just school age, because today we're talking about just the importance of that self-worth in school age children. So now we have our middle childhood developmental stage. And these children begin to like identify just their personality traits, the positive and negative things they're really paying attention to that. And at this stage, they'll describe themselves. They have more experiences. They start to have more experiences. They're exposed to more, and they'll describe themselves as a result of those experiences and the people and things that they interact with in their environment. Then we have late childhood, and we talked about that comparison earlier with the young age children. And basically here, they will do the comparison, right? And so it's not necessarily about you have 6 pieces of the candy, I have 4, but they'll compare themselves and then base that on how they see themselves. And this is the important part right here. And so this part right here is where and why we're talking about what we're talking about today. So in this late childhood stage, they're comparing, they're noticing how they're being treated, how other children are being treated. But then they're evaluating self based upon that treatment. So if we have a situation where legitimately there's unfair treatment, or someone has access to a resource or something and they don't, they begin to notice that they're being treated differently. And not just the noticing, but then now I'm evaluating myself. So now how I'm being treated or how I see things impacts how I see me, right? So how does the world see me? And then now I'm connecting that with how I see myself. Whereas earlier, when I talked about the candy pieces, it's unfair because I just want more. I want more candy, and it's just unfair. You'll hear young children. I know I said it a lot as a child, and I hear my children say it. That's not fair. That's not fair. But now the danger is in the evaluation, how I see me. So how you treat me, or how I believe you treat me, or I perceive, is how I see myself. So children also at this stage, they're adapting to cultural and societal values and standards. And once again, judging to see, how do I measure up to these standards? So this is the part where, once again, repeating the importance of the self-worth, right, in our Black children. Because although we talk about child development and all of these things are applicable, right, in terms of the stages and the experiences and the brain development, all of those things, right? But ultimately, those societal and cultural values and standards, there's a stage when they're being judged, or they're paying attention to how they're being judged and how do they measure up to these standards. And that's the danger. So we don't instill the importance of self-worth and why it's important for our Black children, then we will see them have challenges that they don't need to face in their life. So what is self-worth? So we talked about what school age looks like, the stages, child development, and what that is. And so let's talk a little bit about self-worth. So, I love defining. So dictionary.com. So online, when I'm looking up how does the dictionary define what self-worth is? And so self-worth is a sense of one's own value. And I want to just kind of dig into that a little bit. One's own value, one's own. One meaning me, I'm the one, you're the one, our children are the one when it comes to themselves, their own value or worth as a person, their self-esteem, their self-respect. And so I'm going to add to this definition and just say a big part of our self-worth too, our self-esteem, our self-respect. We've talked about this before, our boundaries. So we're wanting to make sure that we're aligning self-worth to the idea of boundaries, to help our children see the importance of setting boundaries and having those lines that are drawn for themselves, and being able to determine what their boundaries are. When someone's too close to them, when something feels uncomfortable, when they hear something or see something that does not make them feel good or doesn't feel right. So we're wanting to combine and connect their self-worth, how they see themselves, and the importance of the value of their boundaries, and teach them that, right? And self-worth is molded over and over again by life experiences. So, with so much going on and in the world outside of our homes, so there's enough going on within our homes, but then outside of the world, there's so much that molds and shapes and changes how we see ourselves. There's life experiences that pick us up, and there are those that knock us down. So we want to make sure that we're understanding that it is about one's own value and worth as a person, and how they feel about themselves, how they see themselves. And it's an inward piece. It's inward, right? And it's molded by life experiences. So we want to be mindful how experiences can alter how we see us, and then the importance of how we see who we are and our self-esteem. So how self-worth works. So self-worth is often based upon how children believe they're being perceived. And we're going to start with home. And it's usually by the most important adults in their life, which are parents or their caregivers. Whoever's within that home, that is first and foremost how their self-worth is starting to be built. That home experience. How is someone seeing me? And how they're being seen is correlated with how they're being treated, how they're being nurtured. We know that there is nature and nurture. So there are going to be things that are innate that, if you have children, they all have a different temperament. And I remember my daughter as a baby would cry, and she would cry. And then like no matter what her needs were being met, I'm like, she cries so much. And so basically I remember the pediatrician, we talking about it, and she said to me, this may be her temperament. And she cries today. She's very sensitive, and I love her for who she is. And I always tell her and share with her that, like, even that word, we're vilified often for being sensitive, and it's not a negative thing at all. So her sensitivity shows her empathy, her love, her care, and it's not a negative piece of who she is. And so ultimately we have the nature nurture. Naturally, she's that way. And so then the nurture piece is, I know that she's that way, so I want to promote who she is. And there was a time when she felt bad for crying all the time. She was like, I want to not cry. I want to not feel this way, because she thought it was a bad thing to feel how she felt, And so basically my nurture piece was to instill in her that there was nothing wrong with who she was and who she's becoming, and that it was okay. And so ultimately that's what we see. So it was my responsibility as an adult to do that. Children need to feel secure in the present moment. So we often reflect on the past, we look ahead to the future. The future represents hope. Our children are on this journey to be these adults on their own, living their life, being self-sufficient. But it's so important that children feel security in the present moment. And when we say security, we mean physical security, we mean emotional security. And they have to feel that in the present moment. And if they can't feel that in the present moment, they have challenges as seeing themselves secure in the future. So it starts with the right now, and then they can connect that future security, right? They could see ahead of them. They could have hope for what's ahead, but they have to experience that in the present time. Self-image is enhanced by praise and acceptance. And I don't mean, when I say, and I say enhance, right? So like we're adding to them, right? We're not making up. So like every word that I say, my children or anyone in this world can hang on my words, but we're going to enhance it. It's like putting on a nice outfit, or putting on something and then putting on a piece of jewelry to enhance it. The outfit was nice. The jewelry enhanced it. It made it, added to it. So we want to offer praise and acceptance, and we want to be mindful of what that praise looks like. And so we want to be very, very specific with how we praise also. So we want to say with our children, not that good, bad. We want to say like, you did really well at that situation, or how you handled it. So different types of praise as well, because they have different experiences. So we want to offer that acceptance, as I stated earlier, for, my daughter, for example, and who she is, and that she cries, but she's a great student. She's a great sister. She's a great friend. And so just kind of instilling that in her, that who she is okay, and then offering different types of praise. So it may be a praise related to, like, you did well on that exam, you did well at handling that conflict with your sister, sibling rivalry, you did a really good job at like handling that. You were frustrated, I saw that you were frustrated, you did a really good job of managing your emotions, like that's good. Next, so this is good for next time that you're feeling frustrated, maybe the way that you were deep breathing, try that again, because that was really good. I saw you de-escalate. I saw you feel better. That's praise as well. It's not always you look nice. You're cute. You're smart. Those are great. But we want to enhance and we want to offer different types of praise and acceptance, because once again, with our children, with children that look like me, often that look like you, if you're listening to this, often the world has a different message, and we're going to be talking about that more and more, but the world has a different message. And so it is very important that we do that, we enhance, we add to them. And so self-image is often decreased by harsh criticism and unwarranted disapproval, right? So like we're allowed to tell our children that they did something incorrectly, wrong, they need to do better. But when it's unwarranted, right, when it's not necessary, they get that enough. They will get that. If you're a school-age child, once children hit that school door, life looks a little bit different. And so I always remember like being so excited for my children to go to kindergarten, because I'm like, yes, they're in school all day, they're going to learn. And it helped me financially as well, be honest, because I paid daycare costs for years while I worked. And it was like, yes. And I thought about this, yes. But then I'm like, oh, the challenges just ramp up, because I got to think about who's their teacher. Is she going to take care of my baby? Is she going to offer praise and help them to feel accepted because my child's with that person for 6 to 7 hours a day? Is that person going to provide harsh criticism? Are they going to be bullied by children because they, depending on the environment? So we're talking about Black children, in many situations, they're in classroom settings where no one looks like them, So are they going to get criticized? Are they going to receive unwarranted disapproval for just looking like how they look? So those other things that play into the importance of everything starting within the home, because they're going to go outside and the world's going to look different for them, depending on the setting, and it's going to look different. And so there's some challenges I want to just kind of go over. So there's challenges for our children. Like I said, with development, our children, no matter what they look like, race, ethnicity, nationality, there are going to be some developmental things that happen, right? When you go to the pediatrician, they're going to want to know the walking, are they talking? So when they're babies and they're growing up, they're going to check for that, to make sure that there are no delays across whatever, those things I mentioned, the nationality, the race, the ethnicity, wherever, whatever their walking journey in life is, however they look, they're going to have to meet those markers. And then we're checking for that, right? But there's specific challenges for our children. So our children are facing racism, they're facing family issues, they're facing childhood trauma, and then school. So these are 4 areas that I want to cover to kind of demonstrate as to why, and there's so many more I can add to this list, but I want to start with these just to demonstrate the importance and why we discuss specifically the importance of that self-worth in our children, why we talk about it. So let's start here with the race part, the racism and the racial trauma. So racial trauma is the ongoing result of racism, racist bias, exposure to racist abuse in the media. And now with media, right, it's all around us, right? So ultimately, I remember, being a kid in the 90s, we had Rodney King and that whole, I was in New York City, but that was California. And so I would get snippets of that when my grandma had the news on, but I didn't have, and I'm dating myself, there's no internet, there's no way to see it. Sometimes my family would get a newspaper. And so maybe as a child, I would flip through those pages, but ultimately, now in the media, whether it's social media, whether it's on television, we are bombarded by these images. It's constant. So racial trauma can affect many aspects of somebody's life. So their inability to have relationships. Think about, we're talking about our children. concentrating on school or work and feeling safe. And we're not just talking about physical safety, but emotional safety, mentally safe. Because like here, sometimes in here is our biggest prison, being trapped in this thought process, in this thinking. And so when we are exposed, our children are exposed to these things over and over again, just imagining how they are feeling, because what they're seeing and experiencing now as children is very different. And sometimes even just now, it may be things that are even smaller. So if you're a child in school and the children do not look like you in your classroom, but then if you are exposed to comments about your name, comments about your hair, comments about what you look like, constant, right? Feeling as though you're experiencing bias simply because of what you look like. I always have a story, and briefly just sharing the story of I talked about my older daughter. Now I have a middle daughter who in 5th grade went to school with her hair up in a high puff and loving it, was like, mommy, I want my hair done like this, sending her to the school building. And she loving it. She feeling good. She's feeling good about herself. She's loving it because we instill the pride about how our hair grows out of our head, and we don't care what anyone looks like around us. We're gonna love how we're made, right? So ultimately, her going to school and then immediately walking through the door of the classroom that Monday, and a young lady, a white young girl, who was always very, very kind to my daughter, but she walks into the classroom and the young lady goes, wow, your hair looks like an explosion, like a volcano. So guess what? Every child in that classroom is now looking up at my daughter, and now she's a spectacle because she has her hair up, and there's a puff that we wear our hair like, you know, and now she's a spectacle and everyone's looking at her, and it makes her uncomfortable. And already in that classroom, there may be one or two young ladies that look like my daughter. And so ultimately now everyone's paying attention and commenting and saying something, and she's uncomfortable. And so would a child not look at themselves, look around them, see that no one looks like them? And now I'm getting comments about how I look. Would I feel good about myself? Maybe I don't want to wear my hair like this anymore. But just constantly exposed in situations to where who they are, how they look, that someone says, I'm going to like make a spectacle out of it. And I don't think that child had any harm. There was the harm meant by it, but just setting out to make someone feel uncomfortable. And so our children are facing that. So how do you concentrate in school when you just feel different? And so it's now important to instill that self-worth, no matter what they say, no matter how you look and how they look, you're still worthy. And everything that you are building, it comes from within, it doesn't come from outside. So our conversation, because of racism, racial trauma, what we are experiencing, it looks different with our children. It's going to look different. The conversations are not going to be the same because of what our children are exposed to daily, that bias, that racist abuse, right, in the media constantly, in our world, in our schools. So how do we as a parent explain these situations? We have Tamir Rice, and I'm going to give these examples because our children are looking at other children. So when they're comparing, remember that comparison I talked about earlier, they're comparing apples to apples, right? So they're seeing themselves and they're looking at other children, right? So they may be seeing themselves and seeing another Black person that looks like them. They're making that comparison. So if I am a child, a school-age child, and I hear or I'm exposed to, the news is on television, or there's an art, I have the access to the internet, and I read an article or I read something that says that a 12-year-old in Ohio plays with a toy gun. I play with a toy gun. I play with a water gun. This is the mind of a child possibly. And he shot at the playground and killed because he had a toy gun, not because he was doing anything. Maybe I'm 12. Maybe I'm a young Black boy. How do I see that? How do I see my worthiness? How do I see my importance when something like that happens? Do I not see myself Do I not now have fear? Because I don't want that to be me. And then parents, how does that feel as a parent when that happens to someone's 12-year-old and you have a 12-year-old? And so these are the challenges when our children are exposed to this. When I see, I'll go back, and I don't have this listed here. When I have I'll go to a 9-year-old. Let me come back. So then I have a situation now, because in the media we have the trial going on of Derek Chauvin. And so now I'm a child, and maybe my parents, my caregivers are watching the trial, and I hear of a 9-year-old who's a witness, a 9-year-old witness to George Floyd's death. And now this 9-year-old has to take the witness stand. So we have to think about these things and like how these things impact our children and the challenges for them when they're experiencing this. Or then now I'm going to a 17-year-old. So I have a 9-year-old I just talked about, a 12-year-old, and now I hear of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, racially profiled, going to the store to get candy. I like candy. I'm a teenager. I'm a child. I'm an adolescent, and shot and killed, being racially profiled and shot and killed. And so ultimately, if I am privy to information because of the internet, because of television, the newspapers, whatever, however I take it all in, and I'm seeing that there's so much police brutality of people that look like me, how do I feel? What's my experience as a child taking that in? Is that making me feel less than? Am I now operating in this stance of fear because I don't want this to happen to me? Because when I look, I may not see myself in my classroom. My teacher may not be a representation of me, but these people I'm seeing facing these situations look like me. They look like my dad. They look like my mom. They look like my best friends. And so this is now impacting how I'm feeling about myself. And this is why it looks different. Child development is important that we discuss it. And children in general deserve all love and care and support, but why it looks a little bit different for our children and why we need to talk about it. So then I had on the list dealing with family issues. So teaching our children, Black children, about self-worth, we talked about this a couple of slides back, begins at home. Everything starts at home. Parents, caregivers, first teachers, everything begins at home. We cannot be dependent on the world, on school to instill things. So everything comes from the home first and foremost. So we talked in our first series about intergenerational patterns, which are positive and negative patterns of behaviors, and they're transmitted from generation to generation. So we're having children experience just things that are passed down that sometimes aren't the most positive. And so they have no control of that. If you're a child and your parent face some type of abuse and is dealing with the ramifications, the PTSD from that is going to impact how that parent raises that child, especially when there are unhealed wounds. So now we're having things passed down from generation to generation, impacting children. We're having the psychological residuals of slavery passed down to children. We're like, well, how does that impact a child right now? So it's passed down. When we say intergenerational, we're talking about intergenerational. We're talking about, we can go as far back as we need to, impacting our children. And so ultimately, in terms of family issues, we're now dealing with a pandemic. We never want to skip over that. That's going on right now, which we see is disproportionately impacting Black Americans. We are 13% of the population. And so that disproportionate effect, that impact on us is major for us being only 13% of the population in America. And so we're dying at higher rates, and there's job loss, there is loss of our loved ones. In terms of family issues, we have single parent homes where the parents are doing their best and trying their best. We have African Americans incarcerated in 17 state prisons across the country, at a rate of 5 times higher than whites. So we have all of these things playing into our homes, and everything adults are, living in their issues and doing and trying to raise families and their struggles. And we have our children who seems to be sometimes, depending on the child, sometimes not impacted. They're there coloring, drawing, and sometimes chaos is going on around. And so there's so many challenges, and we sometimes are not looking at how our kids are impacted. So we may see, when we're dealing with that trauma we talked about, that racial trauma, and then we're dealing with family issues, we may see our children act out in certain ways. And wondering why did my 12-year-old just have that outburst? Why did my 12-year-old, what's wrong with her? So we're thinking in a mindset, and we're being trauma informed and understanding that racial trauma. So I might say, well, in my home, we're fine. But if our children are experiencing, what's going on outside, so not just in the home environment, but they are impacted about what goes on outside and in their schools. If I'm operating trauma informed, I'm going to stop saying, what's wrong with her? What's wrong with you? And I'm going to say, what happened to you? What's wrong with you versus what happened to you, right? Things are happening with our children. Our Black children and our BIPOC children have different experiences than other children. They're facing something very different. And so we have to keep that in mind in terms of how their self-worth is impacted. So childhood trauma. So we talked about, we can, it coincides with one another, but just wanted to talk a little bit about childhood trauma, which it looks different, because we could say racial trauma and we could talk about that, and that impacts children, adults, but we're specifically wanting to look at childhood trauma. So there are different experiences that can make up trauma, and childhood trauma is an event experienced by a child that threatens their life or bodily integrity. And so in terms of trauma, how it looks, what the experience is, if it threatens who you are. So something traumatic could be physically traumatic, it could be mentally traumatic, it could be emotionally traumatic. And so ultimately, it is a threat. It's a threat. Your bodily integrity. So a part of your body is also your mind. So there's a threat to that. So I want to talk about adverse childhood experiences, or ACE. So I don't know if anyone's ever heard of this. I want to just do a little explanation, because I want to really tie into the idea of how this conversation, how important it is, and how our children are impacted. And I gave that example earlier, how sometimes they can just be sitting around coloring or just sitting there, just seeming unbothered. It doesn't mean they're not bothered, that things don't impact them. So we are all ultimately raising children so that they could be well, and they could be adults who are independent and healthy. So the ACE is the adverse childhood study experience, right? And so ultimately what this is they did the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente, they did a collaboration, and it was a 10-year study of 17,000 people. So now they studied the adults. So these 17,000 are adults, but they're looking at childhood. So what they were looking at was potentially traumatic events that occurred from age 0 to 17. And on this study, and it's the largest study ever done on this topic, and they're looking at just the impact related to these 10 questions. And so the questions ask these adults about their experience with violence, abuse, neglect. If they witness violence in their home, their community, think about our Black children. So when you're dealing with trauma, it may be just in your community. It doesn't have to be inside of your home. It could have been something happening on your block. So now you're scared to walk home. So now you're walking home from school and something happened in your neighborhood. So that's traumatic for you as a child. Having a family member, attempt or die by suicide. And also, basically with this study, it included aspect of the child's environment. So that's if someone in your home has substance abuse disorder or substance misuse, mental health problems or concerns, if there was any instability due to parental separation, or was someone in your house jailed or in prison. And so they basically looked at these areas, and from looking at these areas, they were able to determine a few things. They determined the impact of just what the issues and challenges in adulthood would look like. So they took this information, these two questions, and you get a score from it. They found like, for example, 22% of the 17,000 were sexually abused as children. 66% of women experience abuse, violence, family strife in childhood. And that 1 in 16 of them were exposed to at least 4 of these different categories. And they found that this impact from childhood, it had neurological, biological, psychological effects on them, and their brain neurology changed. Like, so how their nervous system was impacted. They had cognitive impairments socially and emotionally, right? From these childhood traumatic events. They had higher risk behaviors. So they were more now in adulthood because of that childhood trauma, eating disorders, smoking. For the kids, they experienced a substance abuse in their home, and now they were more likely to be abusing substances. Self-harm, sexual promiscuity, violence themselves, and severe and persistent issues with their behavioral health, mental health, their relationships, and even early death. So self-worth in our children, being mindful of family issues, how their school environment, what they're witnessing in the world, racial trauma, how it impacts them. And once again, the importance of why we build up their self-worth. There's so much that goes on with them. So this study, these were the results basically showing how childhood trauma impacts you in adulthood. So remember, we're raising our children. We're raising them to be on this journey towards independence. And there's so much that gets in their way. So I want to show you this. It's an ACE study. You can look it up online. It's adverse childhood experience. They sometimes, they have the examples of the questions before. Oftentimes in a therapeutic setting, the therapist will give their patient just a list of questions to assess what their score is and the level of trauma they experienced in childhood. And so it's a study that says a lot. So now we have on our list, we have school concerns and dealing with inequalities in education, so lack of resources, depending on where the school is and the location. Then we have systemic practices impacting, just our children's ability to achieve the best opportunities, to get scholarships, to get opportunities that help them to grow and develop because of those inequalities, those systemic practices. So when we're talking about a system and things being embedded in a system, you got to think about, okay, where we are now, our children have access to school, but think about historically what it was to be a Black child in school. Think about in history, being called names, being yelled at to walk into your school building, people protesting so that Black children could not enter schools, for segregation, to being separated, for being seen less than. And so those policies, those practices, although things are not that way today, things are embedded into systems. They're embedded. And so we're making changes, but there's still so much inequality. So our children are facing that, less opportunities. Unfair disciplinary practices. Kaya Roll, 6-year-old student, handcuffed and arrested after throwing a tantrum in school. So is the tantrum okay? But remember, how are we operating with a trauma-informed mindset? We're not saying what's wrong with you. We're saying what happened to you. So why is this baby throwing a tantrum? What happened to her? What's going on with her? Not let me call the cops on her. So this young child having this experience, traumatic, and not even understanding when the cops came, not even understanding that she was about to be handcuffed, 6 years old. Then we have Black children often not exposed to educators, counselors, administrators that look like them. So not being able to see themselves in these positions, not being able to get the support sometimes that they need. And remember, I'm not stating, I never would do that, because I come from a human aspect, a human mindset, that we're all human. And I wish these things did not exist, but just the importance of having people that look like you could see yourself. You get support. They understand your challenges from a personal perspective. I think us not having that for our children in many instances is tough. So for example, 99.7% of white students, they attend a district where the faculty matches the student body. And in comparison, that's the situation for only 7% of Black children. 99.7 versus 7. And so these are the challenges that we're facing. So when we are sending your children off to school, and we're talking about self-worth, we're talking about a situation where our children are walking into environments where we don't know what they're experiencing and how hard it is for them sometimes, and the teachers, and if the teachers support them. Giving one more example to tie that together. Very recently in Southern California, there is a situation where now, because of the pandemic, children are on Zoom. We have this teacher who, thinking that she hung up the Zoom parent meeting, did not hang it up, and then can be heard stereotyping Black families, spewing a racist hate and ranting about Black families, right? After getting off of the call with a single Black mom who, this is a pandemic, who faced struggles with the internet, which is expensive, trying to work, take care of her child who is now having to school from home, and then getting off of the call. And then that teacher is now spewing racist hate and stereotyping. And this is the hardest part of all, that child hearing that and becoming so upset. So this is what our children are experiencing in some cases. And so imagine you're a child, you're already within a home environment where there are family issues, struggles, and now your teacher is stereotyping your family, who you are, which may make you look within and say, I'm less than. The challenges faced by our children, and why today I'm talking about Black children and self-worth in particular. What that child was exposed to, hearing that, how hard that was for that child, how hurt that child was to hear the teacher, and the way that children feel about their teacher. I was a teacher. I taught 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 6th grade, and the little sponges and soaking everything up and wanting to make me proud. And when they did something, holding it up and they wanted to show me. We spent 6 to 7 hours a day together, and loving that my class looked like me, and they could look up and see someone who loved, who cared about them, who praised them, who accepted them, the importance of that. But our children don't always receive that. So here's some steps, some essential steps to help children build their self-worth, to help our Black children, our BIPOC children, instill in them, support them in this journey towards independence and building their self-worth, how important that is. So we want to remind them of how valuable they are. They have value, and their value is not based upon what somebody in the world tells them. Their value is because they're valuable, because they're important. They were made important. They're made valuable. At birth, they're valuable. They're a human being first and foremost, and they have value. And reminding them of that constantly at birth and on. Demonstrating love and acceptance for them. So remember, we're now looking at what we're doing within our homes. That's where it all starts. That's where, because we're going to have to, as parents and caregivers, we're going to have to like dilute the mess. You got to think about like the whole process of diluting something, right? So like we're taking something real strong. So in that world where there's so much hate, there's racism, there's bullying, there's bias, and that stuff is strong. We're diluting it. We're pouring in, as much love and acceptance to dilute it, to like make it less strong, make it have less impact, to make sure that our children understand their worth, their value, and that comes from within. They're building that. That's coming from within. We're enhancing that. But it's so important that we love and accept them for them, and teaching them that like how your hair, whether you're wearing a high puff, or how what your skin color looks like, or if you're just a little sensitive and you cry, and that's okay. We're their first teachers, just remembering that. We are their first teachers. They're not forgetting that. And parents need to very importantly, do their own work. We have to do our work. How are we able to instill, support things that we struggle with ourselves? So we have to do our own personal healing. So it is the idea. That's why I talk about parental self-care a lot and personal self-care a lot, because the more that you're doing your personal healing, you're taking care of yourself, you are more equipped to take care of others. So if you are not working or on your personal healing and have not, and your self-esteem, self-worth, self-image, self-respect, lack of boundaries are evident, it is absolutely going to pass on to your sponge, that little person, that school-age child. So we got to do our work, parents, caregivers, doing the work on ourselves. It's not selfish. We can't be so self-sacrificing where we're making sure they have everything they need. Otherwise, they're clothed, they're fed, but we feel broken inside, or we're not healing, or we think less of who we are. We can't instill in something in someone that we don't have ourselves. So if we're building that self-worth in our children, we got to do the work ourselves. So we want to model positive self-worth, because if we model that, it will pass on to them. We're modeling that. We are the role models. There's a lot of controversy now about some of the artists and in the song lyrics and what they're in, parents are upset. And of course, and I validate feelings. If you're upset as a parent and with some things you hear in lyrics or some behaviors of artists, you feel how you feel. You're allowed to feel how you feel. But we have to remember, we're modeling. Everything starts within the home. And so we want to model ourselves. So we want to model self-care. We want to model self-worth, our value. That will positively influence our children, what they see. If they see that, they can become that. We want to teach our Black children about where they come from, and that includes Black history. And you know what? We're not going to just start with slavery. We are more than what our experience was than slaves. Of course, it's so impactful. It shaped so much. However, before that, we kings, queens, developers, we just have a rich culture, developed, grew things, made things, creators. So in the Black history, making sure we're talking about, we're going beyond. We don't want to just say, we don't want us to understand like we were just slaves. And that Black history started within slavery. It did not. That is inaccurate. We want to teach our children about what we've built, what they're utilizing today that was built by our hands, so they can have pride. So if they walk into a classroom and no one looks like them, they can understand what was built and made that they're using in their classroom that comes from us. That when they're eating something in school, who made it and developed it? When they're riding in the car and they see the traffic light or certain things that are developed and grown by us, that they feel a sense of pride, and that they can look and go, I can do that too. I can do that too. So that pride, to help build their self-worth, because so much threatens it outside. So then we want to explain self-worth is not about what they do or what others think. So we want to be very mindful that your worth as a person is not about what you accomplish. It is not. Because there are going to be times in life you can't do. And so does that mean you're less than because you can't do this thing? You are worthy and your worth is great in spite of what you're doing. So there are going to be situations, a student, you have A's that you might not get an A. You're not less than, you're not less smart because you got a B or a C. So your self-worth, we want to teach our children, is not connected to their doing, because you're not going to be always able to do. So if I'm injured and I can't perform the way, am I not who I was before I was injured? It is internal. We want them to understand it's not external. So it's not about what they're doing, even though what they do is important, right? We want to, pump our fist and like promote who they are, but it's not about what they do or what others think, because there's so many others. We want to tell our children, there are so many others. When you start school, you're going to have a kindergarten class and first and second and so on and so forth. And there may be different kids. So if every kid said, you're high puffing, your hair is not nice, or your skin's too dark, or then if we're trying to adhere to the standards of so many people, we'll never feel good about ourselves. So we want to remind our children that their worth is greater. It's from within. They build it every day. It's a practice. It is a practice. Positive self-talk. We're not waiting for someone to say that we are great. We have to feel it from within, and it's very, very important that we do that. We want to provide children a sense of community, right, and connection to the community. And so there are different organizations where there are children that look like them. There's the church, right, getting involved because the church often has activities and with other youth, with children that have similar experiences, and giving children that. I know of people who are connected to organizations like Jack and Jill, or there are historically Black fraternities and sororities that have programs that they've created for youth. And so having our children involved in those things, they have no cost to children, so they don't cost anything. And those programs sometimes create scholarship opportunities. They create character developing opportunities for us as parents and caregivers to look up those things and get our kids involved in our community so they can feel that sense of connection. Maintain a connection and communication with teachers. This part is so, so important. And it goes back to that conversation that I just had a couple of slides back about that teacher in Southern California. Now, if that teacher would have never left the Zoom on, maybe that parent would not be aware of, how that teacher really felt. And so ultimately, even if that teacher resigned, I don't know if they apologized. I don't know the worthiness of the apology, because ultimately racism, racist bias, stereotyping is a heart issue. So a surface level apology, heart work has to be done. That is an internal thing. So how that person felt, the apology is just a surface thing compared to like the work that person will have to do to make a change. That hate is in their heart. So we want to make sure as parents, we know what's going on in that school. We know we're talking to our children every day to hear, are they being bullied? Is someone talking about their hair? Is someone helping them achieve and grow? Is someone making them feel less than? So the positive and the negative. We don't want to just say, how was school? Good, fine. We want to ask open-ended questions. We want to communicate with our teachers. We want to know how, because it's a partnership. We want to know how there is a connection. How am I connecting home, school, and community? We want it to be, it's the village mindset. So we don't want to just send our children into classrooms where we are not even aware that our teachers are feeling the way that Southern California teacher felt. And I'm really doubting that if that teacher felt that way, and it's a heart concern, it's in there, that that didn't play into how she treated students that look like that young man. that there's no way for her to, as soon as she thought she was off that call, to go into that without already acting that out and how she treated some students. And I'm only speculating, but I don't know how good acting could be. How good can you pretend? You know, when something's really within you and you feel that way, it's going to spill out. So parents, I'm just saying, in terms of building self-worth, making sure you know what's going on with your children, so you can remember, dilute the mess. So when you know there's bullying going on, or they're coming home because someone talked about how they look, that you can come in and dilute the mess, and you can tell them they're worthy, they're valuable, they're accepted, they're loved, they're appreciated. Teach them positive self-talk so that you can do that. So just maintaining that connection, because we're talking about school-age children, they spend so much time in school. They get so much false information, not necessarily from school staff, but from other kids. So just being mindful of what's going on so that when we get them within the home, we know what we need to enhance, ramp up more. So if you had a problem and someone was talking about your hair, I need to make sure that I am instilling in you the beauty of how your hair is more than I did before, and ramp that up. So I love this quote from Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. Let's help our children feel good. Let's remember that they're these little people with feelings, with experiences, with emotions. And we want to make sure that they are being nurtured and cared for, and understanding their worth, their value, that we're modeling, that it comes from within. And I love this quote. I do, because sometimes you can't remember the words. You can't quote someone verbatim, but you know how it felt. And as adults, we can remember that. We can go back to just not feeling good, or a teacher or a classmate, just making us not feel good. Or these kids today, these students, we're talking about school age, watching maybe things in the media and not really understanding, but no, they don't feel good about it. We don't want to have these adults that were children that didn't get the things that they needed, that felt less than, and then now they're going to manifest in adulthood. So don't think because the childhood stage goes away, these things go away. They just continue into adulthood and affects relationships, work, everything. So we want to nurture our children and make sure they understand their worth and their value is not connected to simply and merely their hair, their skin, and how the world sees them and treats them. So our reflection activity that we're going to do is here's a journal prompt. And what I'm wanting you to do, because we're just going to reflect on childhood. We're going to reflect. We're going to go back into that inner child place. And so what I'm wanting you to do is I want you to write about an experience that may have influence and security or fear that you might have now. Because remember, childhood impacts adulthood. So you're writing about an experience that may have influenced your insecurity or fear that's going on right now. So we're reflecting on that. Because a lot of times the healing that we need to do takes place in going back to that time and reflecting on it and healing that part of us that's wounded. So we're going to go back. We're doing some inner child work. So that experience that may have influenced that insecurity or that fear that you have at this current time. And so that is the end of our discussion today of the importance of building that self-worth in our children and Black children. And so I hope that today inspires someone to do something different or to keep doing what they were already doing. Let's promote our children. Let's let them know they're important. I look forward to the next few weeks that we have with this topic of the challenges faced by school-age children and what we can do for our babies to make sure they grow and they develop so that they can be healthy and they could have a good sense of well-being. As always, take care of yourself, take care of each other, especially our children, and I will see you next time. Thank you.